Eleanor Peterson woke up in the middle of the night to a baby crying. At first she thought she was dreaming, but the sound was repeated, thin, desperate. The older woman sat up in bed, fumbled for her glasses on the bedside table, and looked at the clock. 3 hours and 15 minutes. The crying came from behind the wall, from Lauren Carter's apartment. "God, I've left the baby alone again," Eleanor muttered, struggling to get up. She threw on a robe and went out into the hallway, knocking on the next door. Silence. The crying stopped suddenly, but resumed a moment later with renewed vigor. "Lauren?" Eleanor called, knocking more insistently. "Lauren, please open up." There was no answer. She leaned her ear against the door. Other than a baby crying, there was no sound. It was the 4th day she hadn't seen her neighbor, but she'd heard the baby crying. Eleanor hadn't worried at first. Lauren often went out for the night, leaving 3-year-old Jaden alone. She usually returned the next day, disheveled, smelling of alcohol. But now too much time had passed. Something was wrong. Back in her apartment, Eleanor resolutely dialed the police number. "Service 9111, what's your emergency?" "I want to report a child who may have been abandoned," she said in a trembling voice. "For days now I've been hearing crying and the mother is not at home." The police arrived 20 minutes later. A stocky patrolman and his partner, a young woman with a short haircut, listened to Eleanor and tried to reach the neighbor. "Police! Open the door!" A man pounded on the door with his fist. "Anybody home?" There was a baby crying faintly from the apartment. "How long has it been since you've seen your mother?" he asked Eleanor. 5 or 6 days. She left with some young man, with a suitcase." "And how old is the child?" 3 years old. Poor kid." The officers looked at each other, and the patrolman nodded to his partner. A few minutes later, the door was forced open. The smell hit the nose immediately. A mixture of stale diapers, sour milk, and something else, vague but heavy. The policewoman covered her nose and mouth with her hand and turned on the light. In the twilight of the living room, one could see scattered things, empty whiskey and wine bottles, an overflowing ashtray. A baby's cry came from the bedroom. The officers walked through the cluttered living room. On the bed, curled up, lay a little boy in a dirty t-shirt and wet pants. His face was red with tears, his voice hoarse from crying. "Hey, baby," the policewoman called softly as she came closer. "It's okay, we're here to help. What's your name?" The child shuddered and instinctively moved back against the wall. "Mommy," he sobbed. "I want my mommy." "We'll find your mommy," she promised, slowly approaching. "My name is Sarah. What's yours?" "Jaden," the boy said softly. "It's very nice to meet you, Jaden. You must be hungry. Are you hungry?" The boy nodded, still wary of the strangers. The patrolman looked around the kitchen. The refrigerator was almost empty. A few cans of beer, a dried-up piece of cheese, a bottle of ketchup. There was an empty pizza box on the table and a mountain of unwashed dishes in the sink. "Call Child Protective Services," he told his co-worker. "And a detective. There's obviously something wrong here." Detective Raymond Morgan arrived an hour later. By then, Jaden had been fed hot soup and a sandwich that Mrs. Peterson had made and changed into clean clothes. A social worker had already picked up the child. Morgan, a tall man with tired eyes and early gray hair, looked around the apartment in silence. 48 years, 20 of them on the police force. He'd seen a lot of dirty houses and dysfunctional families, but every time he'd encountered abandoned children, he'd felt a muffled irritation. "What about the mother?" he asked the patrolman. "Lauren Carter, 35, single mom. According to a neighbor, she left her kid alone a lot. Works at some kind of bar or club." "Did you run a background check?" 2 priors for drug possession, 1 for disorderly conduct. No priors, but clearly a troubled individual. Morgan nodded and began a methodical search of the apartment, wearing latex gloves. He spent nearly an hour going through bills, letters, looking in closets. In a desk drawer, he found a folder with notices from Child Protective Services and unread letters from daycare. In the bedroom, under the bed, he found a bag of white powder. "Cocaine," he stated. "I'm not surprised. Wait a minute." Among the papers on the table was a recently written check for $75,000 and a note with the address of the Palm Breeze Hotel in Miami. "We should call that hotel," Morgan said. See if she was there. Just then, another police officer appeared in the doorway. Detective Morgan, there's a phone call for you. It's a call from Miami. Ray picked up the phone, listening to the message from his colleague at Miami Metro. His face remained impassive, but his fingers gripped the phone tighter. Are you sure it's her? He asked. Lauren Carter, 35 years old. Yeah, that's a match. And the other victim? Alex Reed, 21 years old. I got it. Thanks for the info. He hung up the phone and turned to the patrolman. Last night, a car went off a cliff on the coastal highway in Miami. The driver lost control on a sharp curve. The car fell 40 feet and caught fire. The two fatalities are a woman and a man, preliminarily identified as Lauren Carter and one Alex Reed. Oh God, the policewoman whispered. Poor baby. Check everything again, Morgan ordered. Collect any documents, photos, anything that might help us contact the family. The kid must have a father, I guess. He walked around the apartment one more time, scrutinizing every detail. In the bathroom, expensive brand cosmetics mixed with empty pill bottles. In the living room, a stack of unpaid bills. On the refrigerator, a magnet with the number of a food delivery service. Among the pictures on the wall, one caught his eye. Lauren, still with her long hair, holding her newborn, Jaden. Standing next to her is a tall man with a serious expression. From the date on the photo, it was 3 years ago. Morgan took the picture off the wall and turned it over. On the back, it read, Jaden, Mom and Dad, discharge day. Find me a father, he told the patrolman. Start by checking the child's birth certificate. Eleanor Peterson sat on the couch in her apartment, nervously fiddling with her lace handkerchief. Detective Morgan sat in the chair across from her, taking notes on her statement. Tell me again, when was the last time you saw Miss Carter? It was last Thursday, around 6 p.m. I was coming back from the store and she was coming out with a suitcase. She had a young man with her, tall, skinny, jeans, and a leather jacket. Had you seen him before? No, although Lauren had been bringing men in a lot the last few weeks. But this one was younger than usual. Morgan jotted down the information in his notebook. And the baby? Did she say anything about him? I asked where she was going with the suitcase. She said she was going to Miami to party with her new boyfriend. I asked about Jaden and Eleanor stammered. She said she'd be back the next day, that the kid was used to being alone. He's a big boy now, was what she said. And you didn't inform Child Protective Services? Yeah. I should have. Tears appeared in the woman's eyes. But she always came back. And this time, if I'd known. Morgan shook his head. Don't blame yourself, Mrs. Peterson. These things happen. You couldn't have known. He asked a few more questions about Lauren, her lifestyle, who else might have been aware of her departure. Then he thanked Eleanor and got up to leave. Detective, the old woman called out to him. What's going to happen to the boy? Morgan stopped in the doorway. We're looking for his father. If we find him, the kid will probably go to him. If not, he'll go into foster care. Poor thing, Eleanor sighed. So young and already an orphan. That evening, Ray Morgan sat at his desk, looking at the photos of the accident, which sent colleagues from Miami. A black sedan, crumpled, charred, lay on the rocks at the base of the cliff. The bodies had already been taken away, but the photos showed traces of blood on the pavement and broken glass. The preliminary report read, driver failed to control on a sharp curve. Possible cause is alcohol intoxication. A common occurrence on a coastal highway, especially at night. Tearing himself away from the photos, Morgan reviewed the paperwork he'd collected. Lauren's parents couldn't be found. Both had died several years ago. No other close relatives had been found either. But Jaden's birth certificate contained his father's name, Brian Foster. The address on the paperwork was out of date, but they'd managed to find a new one through the database. Morgan dialed the number. Brian Foster? He asked when he heard a man's voice. Yeah, that's me. Who am I speaking to? Detective Raymond Morgan, NYPD. I'm calling about Lauren Carter and your son Jaden. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Did something happen to Jaden? I could hear the concern in his voice. Your son is fine, but we have reason to believe that his mother, Lauren Carter, was killed in a car accident. Oh my God, Brian exhaled. Jaden? Was he with her? No. The boy was left alone in the apartment. He was discovered by the neighbors. Alone? Brian's voice shook with anger. She left him alone? For how long? 6 days, apparently. There was a thud on the other end of the wire, as if a fist had slammed into the wall. Where is he now? Jaden? In the care of social services. Mr. Foster, we're going to need to meet. There are formalities to be arranged, and I'll need your help with the investigation. I'm leaving immediately, Brian said firmly. I'll be there in 3 hours. Morgan hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair. It had been a long day, and tomorrow he would have to deal with the cause of the car accident that had claimed the life of a mother who had abandoned her child for dubious entertainment. He took another look at the picture of the wrecked car. Something about this story clung to his professional instincts. Something wasn't right here. Brian Foster walked into the social services visitation room, nervously clenching and unclenching his fists. A tall, trim man with a short haircut and attentive eyes. Detective Morgan watched him freeze when he saw his son. Jaden was sitting at a small table, going over colored cubes under the supervision of a social worker. Jaden, Brian called softly, kneeling down. The boy lifted his head. A second of uncertainty, then his eyes widened with recognition. Daddy! He rushed forward, crashing into his father's open arms. Brian hugged his son tightly, burying his face in his hair. His shoulders shook. Morgan turned away, giving them a moment of privacy, and met his eyes with the social worker, a young woman with a kind smile. They do know each other, she remarked quietly. Yes, according to the paperwork, Mr. Foster never gave up his parental rights. 15 minutes later, Morgan and Brian were sitting in a small cafe nearby. Jaden remained in the care of the social workers while the paperwork was processed. How often did you see your son? The detective asked, stirring his coffee. Brian grinned bitterly. Once a month, by court order. Sometimes Lauren canceled at the last minute. Sometimes she just wouldn't answer the door when I arrived. I filed complaints, but the system protects mothers, even mothers like her. You tried to get custody? 3 years. 3 years of litigation. Brian rubbed his eyes. I provided evidence of her unfitness, testimony from neighbors, pictures of the apartment, even recordings of her threatening phone calls. But every time she showed up in court with the kid, nicely dressed, new haircut. The perfect mother. He took a sip of coffee, trying to hide the trembling in his hands. And after the hearing, she'd pick up another child support check and disappear for a week. The kid's either at some random acquaintance's house or, Brian stammered, or alone. God, if only I'd known. You couldn't have known, Morgan pointed out. I should have been more persistent. I believed that the system would work, that justice would be served. He shook his head. Foolish naivete. Did you know this guy, Alex Reed? Never heard of him. But Lauren was always drawn to young, handsome men. Money or no money, it didn't matter, as long as they paid attention. Morgan wrote something down in his notebook. I'll need to ask you more questions, but right now, the most important one is, where were you from January 27th through January 30th? Brian raised a sharp look at him. Do you suspect me of something, detective? Just a formality, Morgan replied. In cases like this, we check all close relatives. I was in Boston for an architectural conference. I can provide tickets, hotel bills, and testimonials from colleagues if you need them. I'd appreciate it. Morgan closed his notebook. What happens now with Jaden? Brian asked. As a father with partial custody who has a stable income and a place to live, you have a good chance of getting full custody. I'll talk to social services. Brian nodded, looking out the window at the gray February sky. You know, detective, he said quietly, I never wished Lauren dead. I just wanted her to let me be a father. The preliminary accident report on Detective Morgan's desk was standardly succinct. On January 30th, at 2 hours and 15 minutes past 2 in the morning, a Toyota Camry, traveling southbound on Coast Highway, failed to make a turn and went off a cliff. The cause of the accident is suspected to be speeding and drunk driving. Morgan scrutinized the attached photos and diagrams. Something was bothering him. He called the Miami Traffic Police investigator. Detective Morgan, New York? I have a question about the January 30th accident, the Camry off the cliff. Oh, that couple. I remember. a deep voice with a slight southern accent answered. It's a nasty case. Any signs of braking? Trying to avoid an accident? That's the weird thing. The car was straight ahead, no deviation, like the driver wasn't even trying to brake or turn the wheel. It's like he was purposefully steering into the abyss. We thought suicide at first. But the autopsy showed a high alcohol concentration. We figured the driver just passed out behind the wheel. It happens. Were there any unusual details? Morgan asked. Let me see. Oh yeah, we found a bottle of whiskey in the cabin. Expensive, half empty. I'm surprised they brought it with them. There's plenty of bars within 2 miles of there. Morgan thanked his colleague and hung up, tapping his pen thoughtfully on the desk, then dialed another number. Morgan, New York, I need a copy of the toxicology report on the victims of the January 30th crash in Miami. Names Carter and Reed. After receiving the facts, the detective scrutinized the results. Lauren Carter. High blood alcohol concentration, traces of cocaine. Alex Reed. Alcohol, but not as much as Lauren. And something else. Both had traces of zolpidem, a sleeping pill. Morgan leaned back in his chair, pondering the information. A routine fatal car accident investigation was slowly taking on the characteristics of something more complex. Miami greeted Detective Morgan with a blazing sun and humid heat, even though it was still February on the calendar. The Palm Breeze Hotel, where Lauren and Alex were staying, was a half-hour drive from the airport, a 3-story white building with an ocean view, palm trees at the entrance, and a screaming sign. He was met in the lobby by the local detective, Ramirez, a swarthy Hispanic man with a tired look. Are you sure you want to pursue this case? He asked, shaking Morgan's hand. We did a standard investigation. It's a classic case of drinking, driving, impaired judgment. There are some inconsistencies, Morgan said. I want to check out a couple details. Ramirez shrugged. That's your right. I've made arrangements with the manager. They're waiting for you. The hotel manager, a full man in a pink shirt, was beaming with hospitality, but his smile faded when Morgan showed his badge. A terrible tragedy, he said, shaking his head. We're still in shock. Such a young couple. How long were they in the hotel? January 27th through January 30th. 3 nights. A suite on the 2nd floor. Anything unusual about their behavior? The manager's confused. Well, you know, it's a resort hotel. People are acting, relaxed. And yet, there have been a few complaints from neighbors. Noise, loud music, yelling. He lowered his voice. Couple had a big fight last night. Miss Carter was yelling something about cheating. Did any of the staff have any closer contact with them? Maria, the maid. She cleaned their room every day. And Javier, the bartender. They spent a lot of time at the bar. Morgan spoke to the maid, a round-faced, middle-aged woman who nervously fidgeted with her apron as she recalled the guests. They drank a lot, she said, shaking her head. The room was always in disarray, bottles everywhere. They fought a lot, too. About what? I'm not eavesdropping, sir, but... She lowered her voice to a whisper. But that last day, she cried out that he was using her, that he only wanted her money, and he replied that she was crazy, that he didn't owe her anything. The meeting with the bartender brought even more details. He was a slippery type, that guy, Javier said, wiping down the bar. Always flirting with other women as soon as his girlfriend stepped away, and once I saw him put something in her drink. What? Morgan was worried. I don't know what it was. Some kind of powder. He didn't think I'd notice, but I did. He also asked about financial services, where to cash a check, notaries. Notaries? Yeah, he said they needed something done right away. I gave him Eduardo's contacts. He has an office nearby. Eduardo Gomez, a notary with 30 years of experience, reluctantly let the detective into his office. I don't disclose client information, he said, glaring at Morgan unpleasantly. Mr. Gomez, this is about 2 dead people and possible fraud. I can get a warrant, but it will take time. The notary sighed and adjusted his glasses. Good. Yes, this couple came to see me on January 29th. The woman wanted to take out an insurance policy. Unusually urgent. How much? $1 million, Morgan whistled. And who was named as the beneficiary? Not her child, as you might think. A young man who was with her. Gomez shook his head. I even warned her that it was strange to name a person you had so recently met. But she insisted. Said he was the only one who cared about her. Was she sober? Quite sober. Nervous, but sober and sane. I wouldn't have filed the paperwork if I had any doubts. Detective Morgan made one last entry in his notebook and closed it. Thank you for your help, Mr. Gomez. On the drive back to New York, Morgan reviewed the information he had gathered. The image of Alex Reed was becoming increasingly suspicious. Young guy seducing an older woman, insisting on insurance, putting something in her drink. When Morgan arrived at the station, there was a folder waiting with Alex Reed's background check. 21 years old, no steady job, priors for fraud, selling counterfeit concert tickets, defrauding an elderly woman out of a large sum of money. Anything else? Morgan asked the young officer. Checked his contacts, found 2 women he met just before Lauren Carter. Both filed missing money reports after seeing him. One was Cynthia Becker, 42, nurse, lost $20,000. The other, Janet Walker, 38, a realtor, lost $35,000 of her savings. The pattern is clear. Morgan nodded. A young con man picks older single women, gains their trust, then disappears with their money. But Lauren Carter was with him when they died, the officer pointed out. Yeah, something went wrong, Morgan said thoughtfully. And I need to find out what it is. At the end of the day, he called Brian Foster. He picked up right away. How's Jaden? The detective asked. He's getting used to it, little by little. The doctor says he'll need time and maybe some therapy. What do you got, detective? Some news. There's some weirdness in the accident. Also, Lauren took out $1 million insurance policy with her new boyfriend Alex Reed as the beneficiary. $1 million? Brian sounded amazed. She'd never had that kind of money. It's an insurance policy, Mr. Foster. She didn't pay $1 million, but in the event of her death, the company would pay out that amount. There was a pause. Do you think this guy? Brian began. It's too early to tell, Morgan replied. But we did find out that Alex Reed had a history of scams involving single women. Oh my God, Brian exhaled. So you don't think it was an accident? I think something strange happened. They both had traces of sleeping pills in their blood. The car was traveling in a straight line, no attempt to slow down. They had a big fight in the room before they left. Lauren yelled that he was using her for money. What am I going to do? Brian's voice was strained. Nothing. Take care of your son. I'll continue to investigate. After the conversation, Morgan sat at his desk for a long time, going over the facts. A picture was emerging before him. Alex, a young con man, had targeted Lauren, a troubled woman with money and a place to live. Seduced her, convinced her to take out an insurance policy in his name. Probably planned to fake her death or actually kill her. But something went wrong. Morgan opened the folder with the toxicology report. What if the sleeping pills were only meant for Lauren to pass out while driving? But how had it ended up in Alex's system? The bartender said he saw Alex put something in her drink, Morgan recalled. What if they accidentally switched glasses? That hypothesis explained the strange trajectory of the car. If Alex had passed out behind the wheel, the car could have traveled straight until it reached a curve and then simply driven off the cliff. The detective leaned back in his chair, pondering the irony of what had happened. Alex, who had planned to get rid of Lauren for insurance, had become a victim of his own plan. But to prove it, more hard evidence was needed. We need to check the hotel room, talk to other witnesses, look into Alex's financial transactions. Morgan closed the folder and reached for his phone. There was a lot of work to be done. Detective Morgan sat in his office, reading the toxicology report sent from the Miami lab. His eyebrows moved as he reread the results a second time. Interesting, he muttered, making notes in his notebook. The data was unusual. Lauren Carter had a high concentration of alcohol and traces of cocaine in her blood. Expected results, given her lifestyle. But Alex Reed's blood work was questionable. Moderate alcohol content, much lower than Lauren's, and strangest of all, a high dose of zolpidem, a potent sleeping pill. Morgan called the pathologist. Dr. Chen, Detective Morgan from New York. I have a question about the Reed Carter case. Yeah, I remember. What's your question? A tired voice with a slight accent answered. Zolpidem in Reed's blood. How high was the concentration? Very high. Enough to cause deep sleep or even unconsciousness. I'm surprised he was even driving. And the woman? Did she have any traces of the drug? No, just alcohol and traces of cocaine. Maybe the young man suffered from insomnia, or someone planned for her to fall asleep at the wheel, Morgan said thoughtfully. Thank you, doctor. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair. The picture of the accident was becoming clearer, but more evidence was needed to be sure. The next day, Morgan was back in Miami. He met with Detective Ramirez at a small cafe across from the Palm Breeze Hotel. I need the security footage from the hotel restaurant for January 30th, he said, sipping his coffee. I'm particularly interested in the evening, the last hours before the accident. Ramirez chuckled. Why reopen it? Classic drunk driving, it happens. Not really. Toxicology shows sleeping pills in the driver's blood, in a dose capable of causing unconsciousness. That's really weird, Ramirez nodded. Let's go talk to security. The hotel's video archive turned out to be well organized. They quickly found footage from the restaurant for the date in question. The screen showed an overhead view of the room filled with customers. The camera covered most of the tables, including the one where Lauren and Alex were sitting. There they are. Ramirez pointed to a couple in the corner. Lauren Carter, a slender woman with short blonde hair, was wearing a tight black dress. Across from her sat Alex Reed, a young man with dark hair, wearing a white shirt with the collar undone. They were drinking wine and talking animatedly. Morgan watched their movements carefully, rewinding the tape forward. Stop, he said suddenly. Rewind a little bit, here, watch. On the screen, Alex leaned forward, saying something to Lauren and pointing toward the entrance. When she turned her head, his hand quickly went to her glass. Something flickered between his fingers and disappeared into the wine. Damn it, Ramirez muttered. He really had slipped something into her drink. Keep looking, Morgan said. A few minutes after that, a waiter came to the table with a new bottle of wine. He filled the glasses, and Alex raised his own, offering a toast. At that moment, a couple of acquaintances approached their table. A bustle of greetings began, and everyone rose. When they were seated again, Lauren took the glass in front of Alex and took a sip. They switched glasses, Morgan said quietly. Accidentally. He continued to watch. As the evening progressed, Alex became more and more sleepy. His movements slowed. His speech, judging by his articulation, became less clear. Lauren, on the other hand, seemed simply drunk, laughing louder than usual, gesticulating vigorously. At the end of the tape, they were seen leaving the restaurant. Alex moved uncertainly, leaning on Lauren. She staggered and led him toward the exit. That's the answer, Morgan said. He'd planned to put her to sleep, but he'd taken a sleeping pill himself. So what now? Ramirez asked. I need access to their room. There might be evidence there. Ramirez nodded. I'll get a warrant. Their belongings are still in the hotel warehouse. 2 hours later, detectives were examining the dead couple's belongings stacked in cardboard boxes. Lauren's clothes, makeup, a few books. Alex's personal belongings were more meager. A pair of jeans, a few t-shirts, toiletries. Morgan methodically went through each item. Inside the lining of Alex's travel bag, he discovered a hidden pocket. Shoving his hand deeper, the detective pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Bingo, he said quietly. The pages of the book were filled with neat handwriting. Diagrams, lists, calculations. On one page was a list of women's names with dates and amounts. Cynthia Becker, $20,000. Janet Walker, $35,000. Those are his victims, Ramirez said, looking over his shoulder. Yeah, and the last name on the list is Lauren Carter. Only it's not just the amount of cash next to her. It says, insurance, $1 million. Morgan turned the page. There was a plan. Meet at the Blue Lotus, where Lauren worked. Fall in love in 2 or 3 weeks. Drive to Miami. Get insurance accident on the way back. Get the money. Disappear to the Caribbean. Son of a bitch had it all planned out. Ramirez shook his head. Morgan continued flipping through the notebook. On the last few pages were the details of the accident plan. Slip her sleeping pills. Make sure she's driving. Steer the car to a cliff on the highway. Jump out before she falls. Fake head trauma, memory loss. It all makes sense now, Morgan said. Classic insurance scam. But that's not what fate had in store. That evening, Detective Morgan sat in the office of a Miami police lieutenant, presenting the results of the investigation. In addition to the lieutenant, There was Detective Ramirez and a representative of the insurance company, a thin man in a slim suit. So, based on the evidence, Morgan said, we can reconstruct what happened as follows. He spread photos, documents, and printouts on the table. Alex Reed was a professional con man specializing in single women with money. He would meet them, gain their trust, and then disappear with their savings. We found a list of previous victims in his address book. Morgan pointed to Lauren's picture. Lauren Carter was his new target, but this time he went for more, $1 million insurance policy. He convinced her to take out a policy naming him as the beneficiary. And then planned to kill her, the lieutenant added. That's right. The plan was simple. Slip her a sleeping pill, put her behind the wheel, drive the car to a cliff on the coastal highway, and jump out at the last moment. Then fake a head injury and memory loss to avoid suspicion. But something went wrong, Ramirez said. Yes. In the hotel restaurant, just before the trip, Alex did put sleeping pills in Lauren's glass. But there had been a mix-up during the toast, and they had accidentally switched glasses. As a result, it was Alex who took the sleeping pills. Morgan showed still images from the security camera showing the moment the glasses were switched. The toxicology report confirms that Alex had a high concentration of sleeping pills in his blood, enough to cause drowsiness and loss of concentration. Apparently, he insisted on driving himself, counting on Lauren falling asleep on the way, but instead, he started to pass out behind the wheel himself. And lost control on a curve, the lieutenant finished. Exactly. The car didn't brake or maneuver. It just went off the road and plummeted down a cliff. A classic case of karmic justice. The crook was a victim of his own plan. The insurance company spokesman coughed. Does this mean that the insurance payment will not be made? Naturally, Morgan nodded. The policy was written as part of a criminal scheme. Besides, the sole beneficiary is dead. What about the child? The lieutenant asked. He could have been compensated. The child was not named in the policy. The insurance representative shook his head. Legally, we have no grounds for payment. Well, that's a matter for the lawyers, Morgan said. My job was to determine the circumstances of the death, and I think we can close the case. The lieutenant stood up, extending his hand. Nice work, detective. If it weren't for your persistence, we'd still be looking at this as a simple, drunken accident. Sometimes it pays to dig a little deeper, Morgan smiled, especially when you're dealing with a motherless child. 6 months later, Detective Raymond Morgan was driving down a quiet suburban street, checking the address on a piece of paper. It was a warm, sunny day. The late August sun was still bright in the summer, but the air was already reminding him that fall was approaching. Finally, he found the house he wanted. A 2-story house with a white fence and a neatly trimmed lawn. A blue sedan stood in the driveway. Morgan parked the car and went to the front door. Before he could ring the bell, the door swung open and Brian Foster appeared on the doorstep. "Detective," he smiled. "Good to see you. Come on in." Morgan stepped into the spacious living room. The house was bright, cozy. There were children's toys and picture books everywhere. "How's Jaden?" the detective asked. "Much better," Brian replied. "The therapy is helping. The first few months were hard, the nightmares, the fear that I'd disappear too. But now he's almost like a normal kid." Brian led Morgan to a window overlooking the garden. There, among the flower beds, a little boy was playing with a toy fire engine. His face, once haggard from hunger and stress, was now ruddy and lively. "I got full custody," Brian said quietly. The court did not obstruct, given the circumstances. "I'm glad to hear that. Coffee? I'd love some." They sat down at the kitchen table and Brian poured coffee into cups. "I got your letter with the results of the investigation," he said. "It's hard to comprehend. All this time I thought Lauren was just irresponsible. But to get involved with someone like that? People often make the wrong choice of partners," Morgan said, "especially if they have their own problems." "Lauren had her own problems," Brian nodded. "Still, she didn't deserve to end up like this." They were silent for a moment, looking out the window at the boy playing. "You know," Brian said finally, "I often think about what would have happened if they hadn't switched glasses, if Lauren had taken that sleeping pill, and Alex had lived. Jaden would still be with you, Morgan replied. We would have discovered Reed's plan and he would have gone to prison for attempted murder. Yeah, but Lauren, maybe she'd have a chance to change. Maybe, the detective agreed. But history doesn't know the subjunctive mood. Jaden spotted them through the window and waved cheerfully. Brian waved back. Anyway, he said, I'm grateful to you, detective, for not stopping when everyone thought it was just an accident, for uncovering the truth. That's my job, Morgan shrugged. No, it's more than a job. You gave him his father back, and you gave me back my son. They stepped out into the garden and Jaden ran toward them, holding out a toy car. Look, Daddy, it looks just like yours. That's right, buddy. Brian smiled, patting his son on the head. Morgan watched them, and a slight smile appeared on his usually stern face. In a world full of cruelty and injustice, this little boy had a chance for a happy childhood. The sun was slowly slipping toward sunset, coloring the sky with golden and pink tones. Morgan said goodbye to Brian and Jaden, promising to stop by again. Getting into his car, he cast one last glance at the house, where father and son walked together to the front door, holding hands. There was still a ray of light in this dark case, where self-interest had led to death, a child saved, and a father given a chance to raise his son. Morgan started the engine and drove away from the house, thinking of the strange irony of fate turning the crook's plan against himself. It was a rare occurrence in his long experience, but the more precious were these rare moments of justice,